Final talk before lunch will be really cool. So we have Kyle from Brave, who's a senior cryptographic security engineer. A bit of a mouthful. But today we'll be talking about improving Web3, musing about privacy and security between the wallet and dapp interaction. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with Brave. They're really cool, doing awesome stuff in the space. They also have a booth down there, so feel free to go talk to the people at Brave there. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Kyle, so feel free to give him a round of applause. Thank you.
Sweet, thank you. We'll make sure you guys can hear me there. Yeah, so my talk is basically focused on privacy and security and kind of like different sort of signing interactions. There we go. So a little bit about me. As you mentioned, I'm a senior cryptographic security engineer. What does that actually mean? Basically, I split my time between auditing cryptography related to anything inside of Brave. So things like new protocols that were coming up for privacy schemes, as well as in the primary security engineer auditing the Brave wallet. So if you've got any questions about what we're doing in Brave wallet or how we're securing it, I can help you out with that. A little bit more about me, co-author of EIP 5593. This is probably one that wallet engineers should have heard about, but most people haven't. Essentially what this is talking about is whether or not you should inject a provider API inside of a iframe. So it's a really basic thing that most people should be doing for security reasons, but because of the interactions between wallets and dapps, it actually makes it hard to coordinate. So that's one of the things I'll be mentioning as well. Previously, I've worked on standards in the decentralized identity space, so I was actually a editor of the W3C verifiable credential spec. I've reviewed a bunch of different DID methods as well as a registry editor there. So I've got a lot of experience in that space and a lot of opinions in that. So if you want to, feel free to ask me. And just a tad bit about me, I actually do enjoy reading privacy policies. Fun fact, there's nothing interesting in there. They're taking all your data. That's how that works. So it's a take it or leave it service. So to start the talk, problem one, unexpected extensibility often leads to vulnerabilities. So inside of standards, things like eSign is a perfect example where the original design and intent behind eSign was to be able to open up capabilities within Mist Wallet. And so then that got extended into things like MetaMask. And because of design choices that were originally made in that started to enable things like phishing attacks to occur. So with that, essentially what happened was, with it being a very early signature design, it was too low level of an API, which is a very esoteric term specific to the way that W3C designs APIs. So I have this concept of low level versus high level APIs. And that's effectively defining what sort of use cases are you trying to enable and what sort of extensibility do you want. So with eSign, essentially the design characteristics of it were, we want to be able to sign any sort of arbitrary transaction or any sort of arbitrary thing. So it was a very generic signing interface. So with that, it allowed for arbitrary signing of messages that could be submitted to the RPC once it got moved into the MetaMask API layer. So originally it was designed around a different trust boundary than the trust boundary that it exists in today inside of MetaMask, which is how most people are familiar with it. And so this is what allowed for many scams to be able to occur, was because users couldn't verify what they were signing. So, the specifics of this was the design of the API meant that you had to sign over a hash rather than the actual message. And so within the UX for the user, that means that they can't actually view the message that's being signed. And so anything can be able to be submitted to them, and it creates for a bad user experience. And as I mentioned before, this API wasn't originally designed for MetaMask. So, this is a part of this adversarial interop characteristic that we have within the Web3 community, where it's because somebody else is doing something in a standardized way, and I have to be able to interact with their users, I now have to copy their design characteristics. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. And so this has led to misalignment between the spec and the usage that has opened doors for attacks to occur, such as phishing attacks. So problem two that we encounter is decentralization has made coordination much harder. So what do I actually mean by this? So if we take a look at EIP 712, this is a new standardized signature method. If you actually look at it, there's 4 different types of different eSign type data. And so effectively what has happened is because of some byproducts of the way that the EIP process works, we're now inadvertently being forced to have to like support 4 different methods of basically the exact same thing. And so the reason this has occurred was because they started with an EIP to handle signing of structured data, but then over time, as traditionally happens with standards, things kind of naturally shift and evolve as people implement things and get a better understanding of the way that it should work. And so what that led to was the EIP changed numerous times over time, but they didn't actually address it as a different sort of EIP, or they didn't address it in like a specifically version manner. And so what that meant was you had things like e-sign type data being the original API that was supposed to be called through the RPC. But what ended up happening was some dapps actually implemented based upon v3. I believe it was like Uniswap, for example, did this. And so what that ended up leading to is MetaMask is now forced to support it because Uniswap is already deployed. And so this is a common problem that we're being faced with within the entire Web3 community, is because we have this decentralization that's occurring at the governance layer as well, where we should be coordinating at a greater level to standardize. Then we're left with the question of which one should actually be implemented. And so then, a part of that, moving an ecosystem is harder than developing an attack. And so because of this, like, what we're starting to do is we're starting to move higher up the API layers effectively. And so with this, you can look at something like sign-in with Ethereum. There was a lot of intentional design characteristics that were forced into play because of the way in which the standards worked. So effectively, one of the things they took into consideration when they were designing EIP 4361, which is sign-in with Ethereum, was EIP 191, which is the personal sign, original signature method, was widely deployed among, between many different wallets, whereas EIP 712 was actually a better fit, but wasn't widely deployed. So if you want to be able to get a standard out there, you have to consider not only how are you going to deploy it, but how are you going to coordinate it across many different people who are operating in different manners. And oftentimes these are competitors. The way the standard space works is that you effectively have coordinated collaboration between competitors, and that creates for some very interesting adversarial environments. They essentially made this design choice that they would extend EIP 191. However, this actually opened new risks. So for example, if somebody chooses to implement EIP 191, but they don't choose to implement EIP 4361, then they actually implement or introduce a replay attack when the dapp is expecting a sign-in with Ethereum flow to be signed, but the wallet is only signing a personal sign interaction. And the reason this occurs is because EIP 4361, one of the key characteristics that they're trying to introduce in the wallet, there's only about 2 of them. One of the key things is that you should actually be parsing the domain that's making the request. So for example, in the wallet, you should be calling window.origin and comparing that against the request that's coming in through the message. If those match, then you can display the message to the user. If not, you should reject it automatically for the user because it's likely something harmful. So this is the type of introduction that we run into with the standard space when we're not coordinating, but we're trying to extend each other in these different types of ways. So these are different types of things that are happening just because we're not coordinating on standards. It's not like anybody in the wallet space is actively trying to ignore these problems or aren't aware of it. A lot of cases, it's just because there's so many things that are moving at the same time, and we're trying to keep track of so many different conversations across so many different places that oftentimes it's which do I prioritize? Do I prioritize shipping a feature that's going to get me more users, or do I prioritize this new EIP that I just heard about that, oh, I didn't even realize this is actually producing a wallet vulnerability for my users now? So in summary, with Web3 security, essentially you've got unexpected extensibility can lead to vulnerabilities. So this is the type of thing that we saw within the case of EIP 191 in the e-sign, where essentially what's happening is things are being designed and then used in different ways that they weren't originally designed for. And so that's leading to problems for security. We've also got coordination is costly. So I don't know if anybody's been on a standards call or watched the process of how long it takes an EIP. It's not fast. Standards aren't meant to be fast. They're meant to be slow because it requires time in order for us to actually implement, learn from our experience, and then be able to come to a final conclusion. And that coordination is costly and not oftentimes aligned with business incentives where we want to deploy features quickly. So if I've already deployed a feature, I don't necessarily want to come back and fix it and break my own usage especially if the dapps have already started to interact with it in a particular way. So this is part of the reason that I've actually started to look at the AIP governance process and the CASA governance process to figure out what do we actually need to do to improve the governance process so we can produce better standards and coordinate better. And then finally, attackers oftentimes get to move faster than wallets and dapps. So for example, if an attacker is able to realize that a dapp is utilizing this EIP 4361 sign-in with Ethereum faster than the actual wallet, then that's introducing the ability to be able to prey on specific smaller wallets to be able to target them. So like for example, I believe like within MetaMask, they're just starting to get support for it today, but then there's wallets like Rainbow and Tally, which have already decided to support it. They moved very quickly on it. And so then the question becomes, you know, are MetaMask users being targeted because they didn't move fast enough on implementing this standard? But this is only part of the problem. So we like to think about security as kind of the main focus. But the reality is we actually have a lot of privacy problems that we can't even get to. So I don't know if you guys have realized, but in Web2 space, the primary focus behind Google and W3C today is actually focused on getting rid of global identifiers within cookies. Well, Web3 actually just reintroduced global identifiers by resharing the same wallet address across every place. So like, we're getting rid of it for most people, and then all of a sudden we're like, hooray, we actually like those, let's keep that. And for whatever odd reason, we've decided that like privacy isn't matter in terms of like Web3. That's not the truth that most businesses will say, but that's the actions we're taking. So with that, essentially the way that I like to think about it is a few different questions that will come about, and I like to frame this as a problem of we're essentially recreating the same concepts of browsers. So effectively, a wallet API interface is actually the exact same thing as the way that browsers look at their APIs, and they call it the web platform. So effectively, what I've decided to do is like frame the wallets as effectively a Web3 platform where it's up to us in order to be able to coordinate these different types of things and be able to address privacy questions like this. So, you know, how are we addressing concerns around fingerprinting risks in the interface? So for example, am I like releasing the interface so that anybody can be able to interact with my wallet? That's automatically flagging the majority of the users in the Web2 space, because I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but only about 1% of users actually have MetaMask extension installed in the entire browser space. And so what that means is you've now, as a MetaMask user, you've now fingerprinted yourself uniquely to every website that you show up if they're using something like fingerprint.js. Additionally, how will we address concerns around global identifier reuse that enable cross-site tracking? So, you know, cross-site tracking still comes into play in the Web3 space. We just haven't really moved to that level yet, but it will come. You know, most people are looking at on-chain analytics as the way to be able to do cross-site tracking, but, you know, the business incentives remain there across Web2 to Web3. How will we address on-chain interactions being used to build user behavior profiles based on the dapps they transact with? So if you think about it, if I'm buying different NFT collections, those NFT collections have certain preferences and behavioral profile characteristics that you can analyze in order to build a behavioral profile about a specific address. You know, what can a business then be able to do to be able to utilize those on-chain interactions, to be able to then analyze that and look at it and go, hey, I'd like to specifically target this user and this address using something like a dapp messaging protocol in order to, you know, feed them with like some sort of advertising even though they didn't ask for it or consent to it. So those are questions that we have to face in a coordinated manner. So the last thing I'd like to say to this though is, you know, I basically just listed off a bunch of problems, but don't fret, this is actually a solved problem. If you look at the way that W3C does it, look at the way IETF does it, they're actually standardized things, and we're moving in that direction. So, you know, what shall we do as wallet developers and dapp developers? I think one of the key things we need to work on first is we need a test suite. Without the ability to be able to test our wallets ourselves and be able to make sure that the APIs are actually working in a coordinated fashion, we can't know if we're interoperable or not. And that causes a lot of frustration to the actual dapp developers. The second thing that this leads to is this leads to better coordination, because as soon as we recognize, hey, this test is operating differently between MetaMask and Brave, or MetaMask and Tally wallet, or any other wallet for that matter, we can then be able to look at it and address the question of like, what's the best way to solve it? And that's causing us to get together and actually have conversations to be able to figure out the best way to address this. And so the way in which I foresee this actually working is through systems that are already available today. So for example, we've got Chain Agnostic Alliance where they're moving causes together. I'm actively participating in that. There's CAPE 25 that's moving forward in order to operate in a multi-chain manner. But then also there's ETH magicians and EIPs which have been used today. There's frustrations that are bound to be happening with these sort of governance processes, but the one thing I ask to everybody here is come participate. Like one of the things that I'm specifically working on is how do we improve these governance processes so that we're not pushing people away? And so there's a lot of active discussions happening in both communities to figure out what is the best way to actually be able to address these problems.